Welcome to the Food Bloggers Table. Pull up a chair for authentic conversations and actionable advice from fellow food bloggers and industry experts. I'm your host, Jen, and I create custom food blogs designed to earn top-tier ad income. Join us now at the table as we break bread and build brands. Leaving your 9-to-5 job for food blogging. Tell me how this came about. At what point you decided it's time to go, what it was like making that decision to leave your secure 9-to-5 job to venture into food blogging.
Yeah, for sure. There's a bit of a backstory here, but let's dive in. I started working in corporate fresh out of college. I joined a major company that everybody has heard of. Everybody has filled up their car at this gas station at some point or another. It was huge, and it's a global organization of over 100,000 people. So it's very easy to become a number and fall into it all. Now, I was working there, like I say, I joined when I was 21, fresh out of college. And shortly after working in the London office, I moved up to the office in Aberdeen in Scotland, which was a very random, I got the job offer and within 10 minutes I'd accepted it for a job that I hadn't applied for. It just came up in conversation. So I agreed to it without knowing anything or anybody. I moved up to Scotland, it must have been end of 2019. So I wasn't there very long before the pandemic. I barely knew anyone. I had to make a split decision whether I would move in with my boyfriend of 3 weeks at the time or cross the border back to England and go and live with my family. They were the options. I moved in with my boyfriend and we're married now, but we'll get onto that. And essentially, the job that I was meant to be doing was around event planning and conference planning, and there was nothing to plan, there was nothing to do. So I fell into this, I don't have very much going on, I need to fill my time doing something. And I'd been a baker before, not professionally, I'm very much home baker. And I thought, you know what, why don't I share some things on Instagram? Started doing it. It took off in a way that I hadn't expected. It was very unprecedented to gain a following and to think, now I need to build a website, now I need to do this. And we'd joked at home, we talked about, oh, what if that was your full-time job? But it wasn't bringing in any kind of income that made that feasible. We shelved it, moving along a few years, and my husband got a job offer to move to Houston. And with it, they were offering me a job. So they moved us both to Houston, at which point the entire environment of everything changed for me. There is a lot more money to be made in the US than Europe in terms of brand partnerships, in terms of advertising on your website. All of these new revenue streams came in that were just not open to me before. And it made it more feasible. It made it more of an option that quitting could make sense, where before it just wouldn't. And I'd also really had that internal battle of, I've got a degree that I worked really hard for. I've got post-grad qualifications. I've spent all this money on education. I can't just dump it all and say whatever. So it took a really long time to come to the conclusion that it was the right time to quit. And I joke about this, and a lot of people ask me all the time about it, but I say to them, the moment you feel ready to leave, it's already too late.
And you're exactly right. That is so true.
I think it's not a bad thing. I think it just, the moment your brain has fully accepted it's time to do something different, you could have done that up to a year ago and been completely fine. It just takes our brain a longer time to put two and two together that, okay, this is comfortable, we'll try it. And we were in a great stage of our life. So it all came to a head December 2023 when I had a conversation with a senior leader from my company who said that in order to do the role well, you needed to be a perfectionist. And all of these things that I thought, that just isn't me. I've never been that person. I'm a creative. I mostly do copywriting and writing for PR and internal communications. And that was my whole background. It's not really creative writing, but it is. It's how can we turn this horrible piece of information into something readable?
Somebody actually wants to read.
Yeah, nobody wants to read it. How do we make people read it? Or things like, how do we get people to come back to the office without hating our guts? How do we get people to adhere to COVID policy without thinking we're all morons? It was a really interesting job that we never expected to be my job. And it just got to that point that I was like, that's me told. And I hopped into the car with my husband after work and I was crying, just sobbing. I'd cried at my desk after this call and I cried on the way home, and he just turned around and said, if this isn't your sign, I don't know what is. And he'd been pushing for a long time to say, you know what, just try it. We can make do, we can afford our rent and our bills. We're not going to go homeless. We're not going to struggle, just quit. And I'm in an incredibly privileged position. That was our case. And I know not everybody is in that situation where quitting their job is not going to threaten their livelihood and their way of life as they know it. So it all came to a head then, and I thought, you know what, you're right. My book was coming out, my cookbook was being released, and brand deals were starting to approach me, but I couldn't accept any of them because of the visa type I was on. So I was turning down all of this money, and I just thought, you know what, let's go and do the visa change and play around with it. There was a lot of bureaucracy that needed to be done, but we did it, and here I am over a year later. I handed in my notice January last year, and it's going great. So very long
Wow.
story there packed in, but that's how I ended up here.
Nice. One thing that I know, and I've said, discomfort we know is less scary than comfort we don't know. Our brains like consistency, we like routines, we like habits. That's why habits are so hard to break. So even if we're in a job or in a situation that we hate, we are more likely to stay in that because we know all the bad and we've seen all the bad. And we're like, okay, as much as I hate it, at least I know this bad, but what bad could be over here? And we make much more of this that could actually be something so beautiful and the next step in our journey, but our brains just can't process it. And so that's why usually it takes that one last straw. And our brains are really good at saying food blocking is a very competitive market. And who am I? Everybody's already done everything I've ever thought of. And so they might stay in a job that they're not happy with. Like you said, you were in a job that wasn't allowing you to be the creative person that you needed to be.
Right.
What would you suggest to someone who is on the fence and they are scared? What would you say to encourage them?
I think if you're already thinking about it, you're 99% of the way there. I think it's a giant leap to make mentally, but physically it's not. Likelihood is you're already doing all the work. If you are where you are by just treating it like a part-time job, imagine how far it could go as a full-time job. Imagine how far it could go if that was using 100% of your brain rather than the 10% you have left after working for somebody else and making them more money. I think the best thing you can do is just say, you know what, I'm going to give it a year. Give yourself a limit and say, I'll give it a year. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but I tried, and see where you go from there. That was what I told myself, and I'm a year in and I'm never going back. Maybe one day you'll quote me on this and be like, wow, liar. But I'm never going back to corporate based off of this. Whereas when I left, I said, right, I'm going to leave the door open. I'm going to keep my LinkedIn profile going, and in case. I'm going to leave the door open. I'm going to keep my LinkedIn profile going in case I had a backup plan, and I'm not going to use that backup plan. So that's my one thing I say to people is just take where you are now and imagine you had all of your energy to put into something you're truly passionate about. It's always worth it. And you will leave the end of your workday every day so much happier than you were before. And that in and of itself is worth it.
I agree with you 100%. Now, one thing you said was that you all were financially okay. What suggestions would you tell to somebody who's, okay, I might be able to give it a year, but I don't even know where to start on the whole figuring out if I've got enough money saved up to not just make the investment of time, but there may be even investments of money. Do you have any suggestions for people in that respect?
Yeah, so I know of a lot of women who quit their full-time job to pursue food blogging. A lot of them, and there are a couple of schools of thought here, a few of them had backup money that they'd built up, a savings account that they had built up to make sure rent and bills were paid over the next few months. And then they got to a point that they were like, I'm good, I'm set, I'm fine, I'm rolling in it, I'm good to go. And the other school of thought that I see quite a lot is they'll quit something full-time that took a lot of their brain, and they will take on a job that they start and end in as part-time. For example, receptionist at a gym. They work part-time at Whole Foods or something like that, something that is giving you, first of all, maybe healthcare, depending on the job, but it's giving you just that secure income that maybe it's only just enough to cover rent, but it's enough that you're going to live. And that's key. So I think it really depends on the person and who you are and how you're set up and how you're hardwired to live. There are definitely sacrifices we all have to make when it comes to making that jump to living with less money. And I know for me, I thought that would be more of a challenge than it was. When I worked in corporate, I was getting to payday every 2 weeks and thinking, right, what can I buy? What pair of shoes, what handbag am I going to splurge on? Because it felt I needed something in front of me to show that work was worth doing. And now I'm in this role, whenever I get paid, I never think to buy something like that anymore. I'm just so comfortable and so happy internally in what I do that I don't need things to remind me why I do it. I'm just so happy and in love with my job every day, and that's reward enough. So my mentality toward how I spend my money has changed too.
Wow. I never even thought about that. Most of us have these voids that we try to fill with stuff, materialistic stuff. And it's interesting that when we find fulfillment in the job that we're doing, and it doesn't even feel like a job, there's parts of it, I don't care how much you love a job, that you dislike about it.
Yeah.
But when you get to do a job and you actually look at it as, I get to do this, and you're in love with it, it changes the dynamic of everything. And literally, that's what it sounds like your job was. It was so hard for you in so many aspects that you were like, I have to reward myself for everything I've given up. There has to be a trade-off. And I find that fascinating because I've never really thought about it that way. But when you really drill down to it, that's the truth. And now you actually physically don't need stuff, because if you're working from home, you don't have to pay the gas to go to your job. And that's something people don't think about. Wear and tear on your vehicle. If you have children, perhaps you had a daycare, a preschool, a nanny, someone that was taking care of your children. You don't need the clothes. You don't need the handbags. You don't need the shoes, because if you're like me, you're wearing your robe around looking like, as my husband calls me, a swamp donkey. Isn't that a nice thing?
Right?
That's what he calls me. Thank you, honey. Pet name and all that. You'd realize there's a lot of stuff that you actually don't need if you're not going out of the house. So all of a sudden, your expenses actually do get lower, and your whole mindset towards it changes. What would be your last words to anyone who is listening to this episode and they are just wondering, is it the right time?
Like I said earlier, if you think there is even the tiniest chance that it is the right time, then it is the right time. Don't wait until you're 100%. You never will be with major change. We always think, but I'm safe here. Even if I'm unhappy, I'm safe.
Yes.
Get out of your comfort zone. Set a time limit if that makes you happier and more comfortable in it. It did for me. And just try it. Just try it. What is the worst that could happen? The absolute worst case scenario is you decide it's not for you, and you're right back to where you are now, and you find another job and you do something different. You're never going to be further behind than you are now. Always worth doing.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Food Bloggers Table. I'm your host, Jennifer Holt, and I look forward to serving you in the next episode.